Oh, I'll start the webinar so people can kind of trickle in, and then I'll start it in 1 minute.
Great. I'm going to stop my share, I think, and I'll start again. Is that okay?
Yep, that works. Okay, here we go. Okay, hello and welcome to Update from Washington, what Build Back Better will mean for agriculture. My name is Claire Weinzerl and I'm the Communications Manager at the Illinois Soybean Association. Today's webinar will look at the agriculture and energy provisions in Build Back Better. Presenters will also highlight the child tax credit, pre-K provisions, as well as provide a reminder of the provisions of the infrastructure package. If you have questions during the webinar, please feel free to type them into the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom window, and we will answer those following the presentation. Another note that today's webinar will be recorded in the event that you would like to rewatch or share with your network. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's speakers, Brian Keel and Abby Everest. Brian is KCO ISOM's Director of Government and Public Affairs. He helps KCO clients track policy developments in Washington, D.C. and advocate on behalf of U.S. agriculture. Brian also serves as Executive Director for 2 agriculture trade associations, Farmers for Free Trade and the Agriculture Trade Education Council. Abby Everest, Senior Manager with KCO ISOM, helps business owners and families to develop a long-term strategy that is reflective of their business and personal goals. She specializes in generational transition planning, helping owners and key family members and/or employees navigate the tough business decisions, emotionally charged family discussions, and entity transitions. With a joint JD LLM degree in tax law and nearly 15 years of experience, Abby applies her expert knowledge of tax regulations to help owners minimize risks, maximize assets, increase equity, and decrease the tax burden of their business, legacy, and transitions. She is a leader for the firm in the review, interpretation, and application of new policies and regulations, and she is proactive in deciphering impacts to clients and finding creative ways to implement tax minimization strategies. Please join me in welcoming Brian and Abby.
Thank you so much. I sure appreciate it, and great to be on with you again today. We love Illinois soybean and have appreciated the partnership and the number of webinars that we've done so far. As Claire mentioned, I'm Brian Keel, Director of Government and Public Affairs for KCO ISOM. Hopefully from the other webinars we've produced in partnership with Illinois soybean, you have a good sense of who KCO ISOM is. But before we get started with the presentation, I'll just take a step back. So KCO ISOM, we're a national agriculture accounting and business advisory firm. We focus on helping farmers, ranchers, and folks in the food and ag supply chain up through food processors, ag equipment dealers. And we help our clients with everything necessary to run a competitive and profitable business. So everything from your tax and audit needs to thinking about sustainability and environmental markets to succession planning and estate planning. I cover government and public affairs, which means I track what's happening on the Hill in Washington, D.C. We watch major regulations. And then we engage with partners like Illinois soybean in coordinated campaigns to try to make sure that those policy changes reflect the needs of America's farmers. So trying to keep the policy changes on the right track and moving in a direction that supports the future of U.S. agriculture. Great to have Abby Everest with us today. Abby is a tax attorney with KCO ISOM and has really been on point with watching some of the tax provisions that have been bubbling up in these bills and then in some cases going away. So we'll have Abby comment on a couple of the tax provisions near the end of the presentation. But without further ado, I'm going to try to share my screen. And and I will walk through a short presentation focusing primarily on the agriculture provisions in the Build Back Better Act. I will say, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat or Q&A function, and we'll get to those after the presentation. Happy to answer questions on this webinar. And as always, if you have follow-up questions after the webinar, feel free to reach out to me or to Abby or to anyone at Keiko, and we're happy to spend time with you one-on-one as well. So now let's see if I'm technologically challenged this morning or if I can get a screen share to work. So bear with me one second. We'll give this our best shot. And now I'm going to run from the beginning. Let's see if this works. There, Abby, does that look right? Can you see the full screen? Okay, great. So without further ado, let's dive into the Build Back Better and talk a little bit about that. First, I also want to provide some clarity. There, as we've mentioned in past webinars, there are two bills that we've been tracking. There's the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill and the Build Back Better legislation, the stimulus package. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill did pass the House and Senate. It passed the House 2 weeks ago and was signed by the president on Monday of this week. So the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill is now law. It contains roughly $1 trillion in funding for infrastructure, including significant investments for agriculture. I've got a slide near the end of the deck, but just quick highlights, just so we keep the two pieces of legislation clear. The infrastructure bill covered highways, bridges, roads, inland waterways, ports, and also rural broadband. So those items, that $1 trillion, has passed the House and Senate, been signed into law by the president. It passed with bipartisan support in both the House and the Senate. The Senate, I think 19 Republicans joined all the Democrats, and in the House, I think 16 joined all the Democrats. So bipartisan showing in both the House and Senate for that infrastructure bill. And I think that showing reflects in part the fact that it was hard infrastructure, helping things like roads and bridges that usually have bipartisan support, and it did not include any tax increases or changes to the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. So I think that's the reason it was able to garner that bipartisan support. That legislation is different than Build Back Better, and what we're going to focus on today is what's called the Build Back Better legislation. This is President Biden's one of his cornerstones of his domestic policy agenda. As you may recall, when President Biden came into office, he had three initiatives that he was pursuing. One was called the American Rescue Plan, and that was immediate aid. That passed and was signed into law back in January/early February. And that was a $2 trillion package focusing on immediate response to the pandemic. So dollars for vaccinations, for personal protective equipment, for upgrading school HVAC systems, and also for payments to unemployed people, for renter assistance, those types of programs. So that was the first package, the American Rescue Plan. It passed and was signed into law. It passed on a party line vote using what's called budget reconciliation. The second was the American Jobs Plan. That was largely hard infrastructure, and that's what passed as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Plan and has been signed into law. The original American Jobs Plan was financed through a series of corporate tax increases. The negotiation with the Republicans led those to be stripped out. But for the most part, the elements of the American Jobs Plan are what were incorporated into the Bipartisan Infrastructure Package. So those are the first two planks that he had pushed that now have passed and become law. The third is what President Biden had called the American Families Plan, and it focused on things like childcare, college assistance, the child tax credit, and also climate change response. That package is what's now turned into the Build Back Better bill. And it's roughly a $1.75 trillion package. Take that number with a little bit of a grain of salt because it depends on how you count. Originally, Build Back Better was proposed at 3.5 trillion because of negotiations with Senator Manchin of West Virginia and Senator Sinema of Arizona, both Democrats. That package has been stripped down to 1.75 trillion. I say take that with a grain of salt because that 1.75 trillion number includes both spending items, but also revenue raising items. So for example, it includes some tax increases that we'll talk about. It includes Medicare prescription drug negotiations, which saves the government money. So it does not have a budget impact of 1.75 trillion. The Democrats argue it is budget neutral, that the revenue raised will offset the revenue spent. So it'll actually be a budget positive bill, is what the Democrats are arguing. No one knows that for sure. Congressional Budget Office, which is the official gatekeeper of all financial information in terms of scoring and fiscal impact, they've been analyzing the bill and they've been releasing pieces of their analysis. And so far, that does look right. So far, CBO has been suggesting that the program would not have a negative budget impact over 10 years. But we haven't seen their final analysis. They're expected to release their final analysis this Friday. So in the next couple of days, we'll know for sure what the budget impact of this proposed legislation is. And after we see the CBO score, we may see changes to this bill. If, for example, it is not budget neutral, you may see some changes to make sure it becomes budget neutral. Because I think, again, Manchin and Sinema in particular have both been arguing for budget neutrality. The other thing to note in terms of budget neutrality that I think is important to keep in mind is a little bit of a shell game in terms of expiration of programs. So the way these budgets are built, they look at a 10-year horizon. And if you start, for example, a child tax credit and you run it for 1 year, the fiscal impact will be the cost of that program for 1 year. So it will assume that the program expires at the end of the year because that's what the legislation says. And so when they calculate the numbers, they'll say this legislation is budget neutral over 10 years, if that's what it is. However, the question and the criticism of that approach is at the end of year one, when that child tax credit expires, Congress is under a lot of pressure to renew that child tax credit. So some people argue that even if it's scored as budget neutral, the fact that it creates a program that then expires means it's going to put pressure on the budget. Of course, future Congresses would have to wrestle with that if they extend a program. And under the pay for rules, we're not supposed to be increasing the deficit except through budget reconciliation terms. So in theory, Congress would be able to deal with that. But I just wanted you to have a little bit of that color. So let's talk about the ag title. You recall when I mentioned the American Families Plan, I focused on child tax credits, child care, college, Medicare expansion, climate change response. In addition to those provisions, the Build Back Better Act does have an ag title. Some of that is specifically related to climate change response and other pieces are not. So we're going to walk through all of the provisions just to give you a sense of what may be coming. I do want to say also, so the House is expected to vote on this package this week, potentially within the next 24 hours. So what you're hearing today is what's likely to pass the House this week. The Senate, though, needs to take up the bill, and the Senate will undoubtedly make some changes. They may work on that bill through December. It could drift into January. It could not pass at all. I think it's highly likely it will pass. But everything we're talking about today is what we expect to pass the House. We'll continue tracking these provisions to see if there are changes as it moves through the Senate. So let's talk about some of the provisions that are ag related and that are probably important for you all to be aware of. The first thing is that the bill provides roughly $1 billion for biodiesel and ethanol infrastructure. That's a really big deal. That's dollars for E15 deployment. It's for pipeline biodiesel terminal operations, distribution system for ethanol blends, again, the E15. That can go a long way toward encouraging the use of biofuels in automobile vehicles. So transportation fuels. $1 billion is a lot of money that will build out a lot of the infrastructure. If memory serves, I think Obama spent over his term about 500 million. And I think President Trump had also about 500 million in infrastructure investments for biofuels. So this would roughly double that spending level. So it would be a significant jump up for biofuels deployment. Proponents of biofuels really like this. Opponents of biofuels, the environmentalists, do not like it. They say biofuels are dirty fuels and are not carbon neutral. We obviously, as an ag firm, like this provision and are hopeful that it will lead to continued strength for U.S. biofuels and for corn farmers. Additional provisions in the ag title, soil conservation assistance. This is kind of an interesting one. It provides payments to producers for crop years 22 through 26 who establish cover crops in their fields. It's a limited program. It's only $25 per acre, and it's only up to 1,000 acres per producer. So some limitations there. I think most landowners would like to see more than $25 per acre, and I think the larger landowners would like to see more than 1,000 acres. It'll be interesting to see how this plays out. I think for farmers who are already considering or using cover crops, $25 per acre can certainly be a nice addition. For farmers who haven't started using cover crops, unclear whether $25 per acre is going to be sufficient to jumpstart that kind of activity. One thing we'll talk about in a minute is additional funding that Secretary Vilsack will have, discretionary funding that he can use for climate mitigation. I wouldn't be a bit surprised if this program doesn't take off, if we see USDA trying to sweeten some of those payments in different ways, and continue to adjust those numbers to try to get uptake on cover crops. Sorry, should have turned off my phone. That's really bad form. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Additional conservation investments. The bill provides funding for 4 existing NRCS programs: EQIP, CSP, ASAP, and RCCP. That's a really important thing for a couple of reasons. One, those are programs that are obviously used by farmers, some farmers more than others. But I think one of the significant things to note about this is by providing funding for these programs, Build Back Better is in essence putting down a down payment on the next farm bill, on the 2023 farm bill. So it's putting money into programs that normally would be funded through the farm bill. And that may make the farm bill negotiation a little bit easier because some of these programs are already funded. Maybe they get plussed up more in the 2023 farm bill. But it takes a little bit of the pressure off of the normal farm bill debate, which might be a debate between farm programs and in some cases supplemental nutritional assistance. This bill also provides SNAP funding, so it could make the farm bill discussion a lot easier. Other items to note: conservation technical assistance. It's providing $200 million to NRCS to provide conservation technical assistance. $50 million to USDA to promote climate change adaptation, and $600 million to NRCS to engage in quantification of carbon sequestration and greenhouse gas emissions. So clearly, they're trying to put funds in to begin to move agriculture toward carbon markets. That's what this quantification of carbon sequestration is all about. I think everyone knows that a carbon market can't function if you can't quantify the carbon being sequestered. So that's what these dollars are trying to get at, is trying to allow NRCS to work with farmers to quantify carbon sequestration so that private or public markets can emerge based on that data collection. Take-home message on this slide, I think, is look for dramatic increases in conversations about carbon and funding to farmers for taking actions that sequester carbon. Actually, before I get to this slide, let me just mention one other point. The bill also provides $27 billion to the Secretary of Agriculture to use through the Commodity Credit Corporation, through CCC, specifically for climate change. $27 billion is a big number. And basically what we would see is Secretary Vilsack having a discretionary fund that he can use to support climate change adaptation efforts for farmers. These will be not regulatory programs, these will be incentive-based programs. So you might see USDA beginning to buy carbon offsets from farmers. So you might see the federal government trying to jumpstart a credit market using some of those funds. You might see USDA providing funding for things like cover crops. I mentioned earlier the cover crop program, which is a little limited. They may use some of those Commodity Credit Corporation dollars to plus up the cover crop program. I think for all farmers who are interested in this space, expect to see over the next 5 years a dramatic increase in federal funding for carbon programs. That will probably start small. 2022, you probably won't see a whole lot of change because they'll be getting their feet under themselves. But by 2023, if this legislation passes, expect to see a significant amount of funding beginning to flow out to farmers who work on carbon issues and undertake farming practices that sequester carbon. I would also expect that you will see this funding flow through Farm Service Agency rather than through NRCS. So it's going to be more akin to farm programs than conservation programs. So keep your eye on that. And that's certainly something CAECO is going to be tracking very closely. Additional titles in the ag title, additional provisions in the ag title, just to round out the conversation. There will be assistance for farm loan borrowers who are with outstanding indebtedness for economically distressed farm loan borrowers. I think this is another run at the Black and Disadvantaged Farmers program that USDA had rolled out previously, but that was then enjoined by the courts. So that's one that we're watching. I think that it also provides assistance and support for underserved farmer ranchers and foresters through grants and loans. So trying to help farmers who are just getting started, including veterans, beginning farmers, and producers living in high poverty areas. And then the Build Back Better legislation also contains significant energy provisions. One that I think everyone needs to be aware of and keep an eye on is the clean energy tax incentives. Little unclear where this is going to sort out, but I think we have an idea at this point of what the parameters look like. And it's kind of innovative. The way that I understand this provision is structured and will likely be included in the Senate passed bill, if the Senate passes a bill, is we will move from energy incentive program. Right now, every type of energy has its own incentives. So if you're a wind producer, you have a wind energy tax credit. If you're a solar producer, there's a solar tax credit. And each industry lobbies for their tax credits because that provides incentives for them to be able to build out at a subsidized rate. Build Back Better would scrap that. It would phase that program out. So for the first number of years, you would still have those tax credits, but eventually those tax credits would go away, and instead you'd have a technology neutral system. So for fuels, for example, the new tax credit system would say a fuel that is 25% below a baseline carbon intensity will qualify for a tax credit. And then maybe 5 years later, that 25% number would shift to a 50% below baseline. So for example, they'd set a baseline carbon intensity for gasoline. They'd say, okay, gasoline's our baseline. If you can produce a fuel that is 25% less carbon intensive than gasoline, you'll qualify for a tax credit, however you do it. So for ethanol, for example, an ethanol company could work with farmers who are undertaking carbon sequestering practices, and therefore the corn that's used as the feedstock would be less carbon intensive. The ethanol company could put up solar panels and run their facility using some renewable energy and thus reduce the carbon intensity of their fuel. So however they do it, if a ethanol company were able to show that their fuel was 25% below a baseline threshold, they would receive a tax credit. And then again, that percentage, 25%, would increase over time. So 5 years from now, you'd have to show you're 50% below that baseline. And then 10 years, maybe you'd have to be 75% below the baseline. So it would be a technology promoting approach that's trying to reduce carbon intensity. Same thing for renewable energy. You'd have to show that you're below a baseline of carbon intensity for electricity, and then that baseline would reduce over time. So you'd scrap the individual tax credits and go to sort of a technology neutral approach. That one, I think, has the potential to really be a driver for market behavior. So we're going to watch what that means for ethanol. We obviously have a lot of ethanol clients, and we're talking with them about their views on this legislation, this particular provision. But there is the potential that this could be helpful. So it's something we're watching closely. Methane pollution fee is something that's gotten a lot of press recently. President Biden was in Scotland this last week at the COP26 conference. That's the conference of parties. So basically all the countries in the world coming together to talk about global issues. Climate change was one of the major topics. And one of the topics that the US focused a lot on was specifically methane emissions. This bill would have methane pollution fee requiring companies that release methane to start paying $900 per ton starting in 2023, and that fee would rise over time. When we first saw this provision, we were nervous that this could apply to animal agriculture, to dairy farms, and to cattle, and to hogs. I sent a note to Secretary Vilsack's office and other folks at USDA, and very quickly they came back and said, no, this methane pollution fee is focused on gas flaring and emissions from oil and gas. It does not apply to animal agriculture. Now, having said that, there was an op-ed in Politico just 2 days ago from one of the environmental groups saying, well, it should apply to animal agriculture. And clearly, I think the environmentalists would like to regulate animal methane emissions. It's not in the bill. I don't think it's going to end up in the bill. I think this methane pollution fee is going to focus on oil and gas and not animal agriculture. So just be aware of that. And then in terms of other energy provisions, $7.5 billion for a nationwide electric vehicle charging network. This is a lot of money. It's a game changer in terms of how dramatically electric vehicles will be rolled out in the US. It'll also incentivize auto manufacturers to begin producing more electric vehicles and to try to move the American fleet over to electricity. I think under any scenario, even if you assume that by 2035 most vehicles are produced or electric, you're going to have the existing fleet that runs on liquid fuels for a long time to come. So ethanol, in particular, liquid fuels, I think will have a continued runway even with this investment in electric vehicle charging. The bill provides funding for power grid improvements. It invests in incentives for additional nuclear power, and then additional greenhouse gas reduction fund for investments in low income and disadvantaged communities. Other provisions, non-ag and energy related, that you should just at least be aware of in a passing sense. Some of these may apply to you or to your kids, depending on your age. First, the bill would provide childcare and universal pre-K. So all 3 and 4 year olds would be eligible for free preschool. Basically, working families would pay no more than 7% of their annual income on childcare for children under 6. So you'd have preschool, universal pre-K, and then you'd have childcare for kids under 6, but it's not free. You'd be paying no more than 7% of your annual income. The bill would expand healthcare coverage through Medicaid and reduce premiums through the Affordable Care Act. A lot of that targets those states that did not expand Medicaid. Remember, some states opted in and some didn't. So this would provide funding for uninsured people in those states that had not opted in. It would extend the child tax credit. This is funding directly paid to parents with children under the age of 6, and it would in some cases provide accelerated payments for the parents to receive those funds. And Abby might talk a little bit more about that when we get to the tax slide. And then this form of the bill provides 4 weeks of paid parental leave for sick and caregiver leave. So if you have a child or if you are sick or have to take care of an elderly grandparent, the Democrats argue that these provisions are going to help solve the labor shortage that we're seeing right now, that by providing preschool and childcare, by providing paid leave, we're going to incentivize people to move back into the workforce. That a lot of people are on the sidelines right now because schools have been closed or childcare facilities have been closed. And so people have left the workforce because they have to take care of their kids. The Democrats argue that these provisions are going to expand labor availability, which will help address inflation, and that they'll also help close the education achievement gap for kids. So lower income families, all kids will be starting kindergarten with the same equal opportunity, which in the long term will build a more resilient workforce. Those are the arguments that the Democrats are providing. And then other provisions, massive funding, $555 billion in tax credits and investments aimed at combating climate change. I mentioned earlier the $27 billion that is provided for the Commodity Credit Corporation. That's part of this $555 billion package. So lots of money flowing into climate change. And again, I think for farmers, be aware that over the coming years, this is increasingly going to be a topic you're going to be hearing about. And increasingly, there are going to be opportunities to secure funding for helping solve climate change issues. Other provisions, some lack of clarity about where Democrats will end up on immigration. I think they want to put funding in for reforming the nation's immigration system. They can only go so far, though. Reconciliation bills, which this is, it's a budget bill, cannot contain federal policy. It can only contain funding and revenue raisers. So you can't see, for example, a bill passing that would reform H-2A visas. It could provide funding for processing H-2A visas, but it wouldn't reform how H-2A visas are issued. So we're not going to see farm immigration writ large taken care of, or U.S. immigration policy dramatically change with this bill, but you may see additional funding for processing paperwork. So now we get to the fun part, the tax provisions. I will hand it over to Abby. I will just say we dodged a big bullet here. I think coming into this discussion, Keiko Isom in particular and our clients, we were very concerned about a lot of the provisions that were being discussed and how they could fall onto farmers. We were very concerned that farmers would end up carrying the load to pay for a lot of the provisions we just talked about. I think we dodged a bullet. A lot of those provisions did get stripped out. But let me, rather than stealing Abby's thunder, let me hand it to Abby and she can talk about both what we were concerned about and what appears to be in the bill now.
Thank you, Brian. Absolutely. So the original president's revenue proposal that was issued back in May first gave us concerns about losing some step-up basis and how that would impact the agriculture sector. That has been removed from the current text. Then we went through the Senate and there were other income tax increases and other issues that we were concerned about as well, and most of those have been removed. In September, mid-September, the House issued their first proposal through the Ways and Means Committee, and it really just kept changing from proposal to proposal where we were having to really quickly pivot on new, really big dramatic items that they kept proposing. So a lot of the things that Brian's saying that we dodged a lot in the ways of estate and tax treatment, increased income tax, decreased unified credit, the step up in basis. All those issues have almost essentially gone away for estate and trust purposes. There is still one little issue outstanding, which is the very first pay for that Brian has out there. Now, so it's a 5% surcharge, surtax, whatever they want to call it, and that's on individual income above $10 million. And then once you hit $25 million a year, additional 3%, so a total of 8% of that has an additional surtax, surcharge, income tax. In addition, that level for trusts and estates starts at $200,000 is where the extra 5% comes in, and at $500,000 where the extra 3% or the total of 8%. That said, that's very minimal compared to everything else that they were proposing. And so we think it's a huge win as far as that's concerned for estate transition income tax planning. In addition, they were looking at reverting back to the top individual rate is currently 37%. Under Obama pre-2017 Tax Act, it was 39.6%. So they were looking at not only bringing back the 39.6 bracket, but also reducing the threshold on where that would impact individuals. And that's been removed from the latest House version as well. So that's a big win too, because it's going to impact less and less families, individuals. We did last week receive the annual inflation index amounts for those tax brackets, for Social Security payments, for AMT brackets. And so that's actually going to be beneficial on that side, because lower brackets are going to include more income. So basically more income will get pushed to lower rates, and hopefully overall reducing the average tax rate that individuals will actually end up paying. The next item on there is a 15% minimum tax on corporate profits. And these are on corporations with over $1 billion in profits. And this is really focused on the tech industry and how some of their income is characterized in avoiding income tax. The 1% tax on stock buybacks, they saw a big influx of stock buybacks. And so that was just a way to maybe get a little additional income from those large corporations without impacting too many individuals. We have the 15% global minimum tax. That has been a big push, not only in the US, but globally, to a little bit prevent the tax havens to the extent that we can. And then extending the limits on deductibility of business losses. So right now, there's already limitations on excess business losses. It's just extending that and making it permanent. So before it was just temporary. So a lot of the provisions in the 2017 Tax Act were actually set for 10 years and then would sunset beginning January 1st of 2026. And so this is one of those that is now going to be made permanent. The item underneath that is actually probably one of the items that we think might impact individuals the most. This is expanding the 3.8% on net investment income tax. So when we think about net investment income tax, a lot of times you're thinking of passive, investment assets. Well, they're expanding that to include essentially income that's passing through S corporations of active trade or business for individuals starting at a threshold of 400,000 adjusted gross income. So that would be single filers, $500,000 adjusted gross income for married filing jointly. So it's a little bit different. There is still the spread between the net investment income tax itself on passive primarily and wages starts at 200 and 250 for individuals and married filing joint. So there is still a little bit of spread between the application of that on all of the income essentially over that 2 and 250, but it's definitely worth taking a look at maybe your entity structure and seeing if there's a different entity, not only for tax reasons, but also maybe transition reasons, things like that. So that's something to take a look at. We did also, it's not listed on here, now there is a limitation on C corporations for the amount of gain exclusion that's allowed when there's qualified small business stock. So depending on the year and other factors, there are gain exclusions out there between 50, 75, and 100% allowed. So it's basically the new provision in here would only allow the 50% gain exclusion level for adjusted gross income over $400,000. That's including the gain from the transaction. So if there is a transaction planned or maybe some phase outs, things like that, that you're taking a look at in your C corporation, that would be something to talk to a tax advisor about, looking ways to structure that to hopefully get a little bit more benefit from that provision.
Hey, Abby, so on these two provisions that you just mentioned, the net investment income tax and the C corporation provision, those affect individuals making more than 400,000. And for net investment income tax, you said married making more than 500,000. Is that right?
Correct. So the net investment income tax would be 400 for single and 500 for married filing joint. And the qualified business stock is 400,000. Doesn't
And
necessarily differentiate.
and flesh out a little bit more if you're a farmer and you have an S corporation structure, how would the net investment income tax change affect you?
So on a basically adjusted gross income on your return over 400,000 or 500,000, depending on your filing status, whatever income above that, that would be associated with that active trade or business income from the S corporation would get the 3.8% tacked onto it.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely. And then now for the maybe more positive area are the tax breaks. So like we said, it's been a huge win on the state gift and trust side. Just absolutely huge win. The amount of the additional surtax on trusts will still be a minimal number of trusts that are impacted. And that's really the main impact, compared to all these other provisions. And so definitely a win. I think we dodged about 95% of the overall impact that could have been had to those entities or estates based on other versions that came out of the House, Senate, and the president's office. The expanded earned income tax credit, so that's 1 year. And the main benefit of that is going to be for households that have earned income but don't necessarily have children. So that's going to be extended for 1 year. Brian already mentioned, the benefits of the child tax credit being extended. So those are definitely benefits to lots of households, hopefully. And then the final item, and this is an item that I think we can't necessarily take what is passed in the House version as law, because this is one item that the Senate has been talking about as well. So if there were to be a few amendments to this House passed version, I think this might be one of those that the Senate would take a double look at. And it's looking at raising the state and local tax deduction limits. It's currently capped at $10,000, and that was part of the 2017 Tax Act. So what that was doing is that was limiting for those itemized deduction individuals. It was limiting how much of a deduction you could take on your Schedule A. So your Schedule A is going to include medical expenses over a certain percentage of your income. A lot of times, usually it has to give rise to nursing home expenses before you exceed that percentage. It's going to include charitable contributions, and that's going to include these other taxes, state and local. That's going to include property tax if your state has income tax, if your state doesn't have an income tax, but there's a general sales tax rate. And so what happens is a lot of people are not getting the full value of the deduction. And so that pushes them either to a standard deduction, or their itemized deductions have to come from charitable contributions or long-term care costs. So this one, it's been going around kind of between the 72.5 to 80,000 range as the cap. And then also the number of years has also been a point of conversation going back and forth in the negotiation. So that's something I would definitely look for. I do think there's a little bit of talk, maybe still talking about the child tax credit. I don't know that I've really heard much talk about these other provisions being negotiated. Brian, have you heard of any of these other things that the Senate's kind of still reviewing?
I haven't. I think the big flashpoints in the Senate negotiation moving forward are going to be that that paid medical leave has been a question. Is it going to stay in at 4 weeks? I think that's one we could see change. I think a lot will turn on what we see come out of Congressional Budget Office scoring on Friday. If the CBO score suggests that this would increase the deficit or would create inflationary pressure, then you might see changes, because I think Senator Manchin in particular has been very outspoken about wanting to make sure that this bill is not creating additional inflationary pressure. I think that's increasingly going to be part of the political calculus. But for now, I think the House provisions are about as solid a baseline as we have to know what could be in the final bill. But there could be some changes over the next month.
Absolutely.
Final thing I want to just go back and touch on. I mentioned the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. This is the bipartisan infrastructure bill, but just to give you a quick rundown on the provisions that were in that bill that did pass both the House and Senate and signed into law. 110 billion for roads, bridges, and other projects. 65 billion for high-speed internet access. In my mind, of everything we've talked about, this is one of the most important provisions to focus on. 65 billion will go a long way toward building out rural broadband, and that's, I think, a game changer for rural communities in terms of telemedicine, in terms of education. I mean, we hear these stories of kids having to go sit in the McDonald's parking lot to access Wi-Fi. This would alleviate that. Economic development. I mean, being able to have broadband fiber into rural communities opens up all sorts of jobs and employment opportunities, not to mention for farmers being able to access higher bandwidth applications that may be needed. So this is one to keep an eye on. Obviously, 65 billion is not going to be spent in a year. These are over a 10-year period. But I think you'll see a lot of tractors and excavators working in rural areas running fiber optic cables. And a lot of that, I think, will probably flow through the electric co-op. So if you're a member of an electric co-op, that's one that you'll probably see a lot of discussions about. Other funding for water systems and infrastructure. A lot of water systems, both urban and rural, are challenged a lot with lead pipes. So this would really focus on that lead pipe issue that cropped up in Michigan, but again, elsewhere. 50 billion for Western water storage. That's a big deal for new dams and reservoirs, especially given droughts that we've seen throughout the West. And then funding for airports and funding for the electric grid. Really key, I think, to know is the bill also includes 17 billion for inland waterways and ports. So some of the locks and dams that are in Illinois and along the Mississippi River that have been perennial challenges for farmers trying to get product to market are going to see upgrades because of this bill. So I think the Mississippi dam and lock system in particular, we should see efficiency improvements in construction over the coming years. Which I think is a long-term boon for U.S. agriculture, since so much of our ag products go down the Mississippi and out internationally through that avenue. So that's one I think farmers are very pleased about, to see that investment specifically in inland waterways as part of this infrastructure bill. So final prognostication. We expect the House to pass the Build Back Better bill this week. I think one question is, will they wait to see the Congressional Budget Office score, which will be released on Friday, or will they pass it knowing that they've received enough of these sort of early analyses from CBO that they have a good sense of what's going to happen with the bill? It could go either way. I think if they wait for the CBO score, they're not going to wait very long. I think they want to get out of town for Thanksgiving. So if they wait till Friday, get the CBO score, I would expect you'd see the bill pass Friday night or Saturday, potentially Monday. But I think they're going to do it before Thanksgiving. I think more likely they get the bill passed regardless of when CBO is released. Then the question is, when does the Senate take up the bill? I think Christmas is a pretty big driver, that you would see the Senate try to pass the bill before Christmas. Senator Manchin just yesterday, though, poured a little bit of cold water on that, saying he doesn't think Christmas is a hard deadline. He thinks there's a lot of work to do to get the legislation to a place where he's comfortable with it. So you may see it drift through the holidays. You could see it drift into early January. I think there's very large pressure for the Democrats to move this bill and get it done. Like I said, it'll undoubtedly, I think, pass the House this week, but there'll be pressure in the Senate to get it done. But it's going to be a nip and tuck for them, because the longer the bill goes, the less likely it is that it'll pass. It can lose momentum. So if the bill doesn't pass by Christmas and drags into January, if something happens to drag it out further, let's say there's additional inflationary pressures, you could see the brakes put on this package and it not pass. I think personally 60% likely it's going to pass, so well north of 50%. It may even be higher than 60%, but it's just unknown because the bill's going to hang out for a month. To me, that handicaps a little bit against it. The longer it's open, the less likely it is that it'll pass. But right now, I'd say 60% likely these provisions become law. So there is the quick overview of the Build Back Better legislation, what's in and what is not in. We'll be tracking the legislation over the coming month and watching the Senate discussions very closely. And depending on what Illinois Soybean Association would like, I suspect we could do a follow-up webinar when the final bill passes and walk through the provisions at that time again, if Claire and others at Illinois Soybean would like. So
yeah, that sounds great. Thanks so much, Brian and Abby, for going through some of those provisions included in Build Back Better. At this time, we're going to go ahead and open it up for questions. So if any audience members have questions they'd like Brian and Abby to take a stab at answering, go ahead and type those into the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom window. And while we wait for some of those questions to come in, I did just want to go over some of the other services available to farmers in addition to the webinars that are a part of our partnership with KCO ISOM. The first is a free tax hotline. You can dial 1-888-768-0056 for a quick discussion with a KCO ISOM expert to gain answers to your questions about the tax legislation. And you can dial that same number to schedule a free 30-minute consultation with a tax expert who specializes in a specific area like estate planning, trust work, farm programs, or farm tax, to go deeper in analysis and discussion of some of those legislation impacts and guidance for your own farm. So yeah, you can find all of those resources at ilsoy.org/tax-resources. And we'll see if we have any questions ready to go. Here's one that just came through. How is a farmer going to find out information regarding carbon credit programs to be at the front of the line?
It's a great question. Well, and I once again, here's a place where I think the partnership between KCO ISOM and Illinois Soy really will be helpful. We'll be tracking those programs. We have a team that is now dedicated exclusively to tracking carbon developments and helping farmers on that front. And I think there'll be a couple milestones to watch. One will be when the Senate passes the legislation, assuming they do. We'll want to do a debrief at that time and look specifically at the carbon provisions and understand what's happening there. In addition, then once that legislation passes, USDA will start working on rules. USDA did an information survey. They asked farmers what they thought about carbon issues over this last year. So they've already started gathering a lot of input from farmers on how to structure carbon programs. But we'll start to see, I would think, in the first quarter of 2022, additional detail from USDA on how they'll be structuring the program. So again, we might do a follow-up webinar with Illinois Soybean on that front. The other thing to note is that there is already activity around carbon credits at different levels. There's Indigo Ag, which buys carbon credits in certain circumstances. I know that Bayer has a incentive program. I think if you're entertaining getting into carbon markets and you want to know what the current state is of on carbon markets, and specifically then what incentives are coming from the federal government, reach out to Illinois Soybean Association and to KCO. We are more than happy to get someone on the phone with you, tell you what the current state of play is on those markets, give you some advice on that front. And then if it's something you want to pursue, we can help you soup to nuts in terms of evaluating the program and getting something up and running.
And I'll also add that Illinois Soybean Association is busy developing some online carbon resources to help farmers navigate through those different programs available. So those resources should become available in the spring. Next question up here is the funding for EQIP, CSP, ACEP, and RCPP status quo, or will it expand the programs?
This would be additional funding. So these are plus ups to the existing baseline. And again, it's good both in terms of recognizing the immediate funding that's available, but also good, I think, in terms of increasing the likelihood that we'll have a farm bill on time, because that funding has already been provided. So it's not quite such a zero-sum game as it is in some farm bill years.
Okay, and at this time we have no further questions. So Brian and Abby, I'll give it over to you to see if you have any final thoughts to share.
No, I just end by again thanking Illinois Soybean Association. You mentioned the tax hotline and the free consultations. I'm really excited about that model. That's something we haven't done with other associations. That was I don't know if it came from Illinois Soybean Association as an idea or it came from us, but wherever it came from, it's a great idea. I mean, the way to provide an entire membership with access to tax advice. You know, a lot of times folks will rely on a local CPA, which is great, but sometimes there are ag questions that are different, or estate planning discussions that are sort of higher level. So being able to get access to that base of experts and not have to pay for it for that initial consultation, because of the partnership with Illinois Soybean Association, it just seems like a really great way to allow farmers to arm themselves with the latest and best information. So I would encourage people to use those services and take advantage of the partnership that we have here.
Abby, any other thoughts from you?
I just reiterate what Brian said. You know, if you have any questions that you think we would be able to help you with, we're happy to talk.
Great. And again, you can find those resources at ilsoy.org/tax-resources. And I went ahead and put that URL in the chat as well. So thank you all. Thank you, Abby and Brian, for your informative presentation and for walking us through what Build Back Better means for agriculture. And thank you everyone for attending. We hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you guys. Be well.